The worst sound in the world isn't a scream or a gunshot, but the sudden, rhythmic thumping of a flat tire when you are 40 miles away from the nearest town and the sun has been down for 3 hours. I remember the way my steering wheel jerked violently to the right, nearly pulling my old sedan into the deep, muddy ditch that lined the edge of the forest. My headlights flickered against the dense wall of pine trees, revealing nothing but shadows that seemed to stretch out like long, thin fingers reaching for the road. I pulled over to the gravel shoulder, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I stepped out into the freezing night air to see the damage. The rear driver's side tire wasn't just flat. It looked as if someone had taken a serrated knife to the sidewall, leaving a jagged gash that no road debris could ever cause. As I stood there in the silence, I realized that the forest wasn't actually silent at all, because the wind was whistling through the trees, and somewhere far off, a dog was barking with a frantic, desperate energy. I didn't have a spare, which was a mistake I promised myself I would never make again if I managed to get out of this mess. I pulled out my phone, but the signal bar was a hollow, empty triangle, mocking me in the pale glow of the screen. Just as I was about to give up and start the long walk back toward the main highway, I saw a flickering neon sign about a half-mile down the road. It was a dim, buzzing light that read, "Hank's 24-hour garage," and it felt like a miracle sent from heaven. I crawled along the shoulder at 5 miles per hour, the metal rim of my wheel grinding against the pavement with a screeching sound that felt loud enough to wake the dead. When I finally pulled into the gravel lot of the garage, the neon light cast a sickly green hue over several rusted-out trucks and a pile of old engines that looked like skeletal remains. The garage door was open just a few inches, and a yellow light spilled out from the gap, illuminating the oil-stained concrete floor. I stepped out of my car and called out a greeting, but my voice felt small and thin against the vastness of the dark woods. After a long moment of silence, a man emerged from the shadows of the office, wiping his grease-covered hands on a rag that was so filthy it only seemed to make them darker. He was tall and unnervingly thin, with eyes that were tucked deep into his skull and a smile that didn't quite reach them. He introduced himself as Miller, and he told me that he was the only one working the night shift because the owner didn't like being out here after dark. I should have asked him why the owner felt that way, but I was too relieved to find help to care about the strange atmosphere of the place. Miller walked around my car, clicking his tongue against his teeth as he inspected the ruined tire. He told me that he had a used one in the back that would fit, but it would take him about an hour to get it mounted and balanced since his equipment was old and temperamental. He invited me to sit in the waiting room, which was a tiny, wood-paneled box filled with the smell of stale cigarettes and burnt coffee. I sat on a cracked vinyl chair and watched him through the grimy glass window that looked into the shop. He worked slowly, his movements deliberate and almost rhythmic, but I noticed that he kept looking over his shoulder toward the dark road. Every time a branch snapped in the wind or the building creaked, he would freeze and stare into the darkness for several seconds before returning to his work. About 30 minutes into the wait, I felt a sudden urge to use the restroom, but when I asked Miller, he pointed toward a small door at the very back of the shop, past the heavy machinery. As I walked through the garage, the smell of gasoline and old metal became overwhelming, making my head swim. I passed a workbench covered in tools, and my eyes landed on a pair of heavy-duty industrial shears that were sitting out in the open. The blades were stained with black rubber, and a cold shiver ran down my spine as I remembered the jagged cut on my tire. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that a mechanic would naturally have rubber on his tools, but the shape of the blades matched the gash in my tire almost perfectly. I hurried into the restroom and splashed cold water on my face, trying to stop my hands from shaking. When I turned to grab a paper towel, I noticed a small trash can tucked under the sink that was overflowing with shredded documents and what looked like personal items. On the very top was a leather wallet, scuffed and worn, and when I flipped it open, I saw a driver's license for a woman who looked to be in her mid-20s. It wasn't just any wallet. It was soaked with water and stained with what looked like dried mud, as if it had been recovered from the forest floor. My stomach did a slow, Sickening flip when I realized the date on the license had expired only 2 days ago. I knew I had to leave immediately, but my car was still up on the hydraulic lift, its rear wheel missing and the axle exposed. I crept back out into the shop, trying to be as silent as possible, and I saw Miller standing by the open hood of my car. He wasn't working on the tire anymore. He had a pair of long-nosed pliers in his hand, and he was reaching deep into the engine bay near the master cylinder. I heard a distinct, metallic snip, followed by the sound of fluid dripping onto the floor. My breath caught in my throat as I realized he wasn't fixing my car at all. He was sabotaging my brakes. He was making sure that even if I drove away, I wouldn't get very far before the pedal went soft and the car became a 2-ton coffin on those winding mountain roads. I backed away into the shadows of the storage racks, my mind racing through every possible escape route. The front door was too far, and Miller was standing right between me and the exit. I saw a small side window near the ceiling, but it was narrow and covered in iron bars. My only hope was the back delivery door, but it was secured with a heavy sliding bolt that would likely make a loud noise when moved. I waited for Miller to turn his back to go fetch a tool from the other side of the garage, and I lunged for the back door. I grabbed the bolt and slid it back as gently as I could, but the metal shrieked against the frame, sounding like a siren in the quiet shop. Miller spun around, his face twisting into a mask of pure, predatory rage, and he dropped the pliers, reaching instead for a heavy iron tire iron. I didn't wait to see how fast he could run. I threw the door open and sprinted out into the blackness of the woods. I didn't head for the road because I knew he would expect that, and he likely had a truck he could use to run me down in seconds. Instead, I dived into the thick undergrowth, the thorns tearing at my jacket and my skin as I pushed deeper into the trees. Behind me, I heard the heavy thud of his boots hitting the gravel, and then the sound of his voice, calm and terrifyingly low, calling out into the dark. He told me that there was no point in running because he knew these woods better than I knew my own reflection, and that the coyotes would find whatever he left behind. I found a fallen hollow log and crawled inside, pressing my face into the damp earth and trying to stifle my heavy breathing. I could hear him moving through the brush only 20 yards away, the sound of snapping twigs echoing like gunshots in the night. He was swinging a heavy flashlight, and the beam of light swept over the log several times, illuminating the spiders and rot just inches from my eyes. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that the mud on my clothes would act as camouflage, and I waited for what felt like hours. The sound of his footsteps eventually grew fainter, moving toward the creek bed further down the slope, and I knew this was my only chance. I crawled out of the log and began to circle back toward the garage, moving with the agonizing slowness of a ghost. I realized that my car was a lost cause, but Miller's tow truck was parked near the office, and the keys were usually left in the ignition of those old work vehicles. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I saw the garage lights were still on, casting a long rectangular shadow across the lot. I crept to the driver's side of the truck and peered through the window. The keys were hanging from the steering column, glinting in the moonlight. I climbed in, and the seat groaned under my weight, a sound that felt loud enough to bring him running back from the woods. I didn't turn on the headlights. I shifted the truck into neutral and let it roll down the slight incline of the driveway, feeling the vibration of the tires on the gravel. Only when I was 100 yards away did I dare to turn the key. The engine roared to life with a violent rumble, and I slammed the truck into gear, flooring the gas pedal until the tires screamed. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a lone figure emerge from the tree line, standing in the middle of the road under the green neon sign. Miller didn't chase me. He just stood there, watching the taillights disappear into the mist. I drove until I reached a well-lit gas station in the next county, where the cashier saw my bleeding face and immediately called the state police. When the officers went back to Hank's garage the next morning, the building was empty, the neon sign was smashed, and my car was still sitting on the lift, but Miller was gone. They found 7 different sets of license plates hidden under the floorboards of the office, but they never found the man with the deep-set eyes. I still don't drive at night if I can help it, and every time I hear the sound of a tool clanking against metal, I feel the ghost of that cold wind on the back of my neck. I got away, but I know that out there in the dark, on some forgotten stretch of highway, Miller is still waiting for the next car to pull over with a flat tire. The sky over our small Kansas town hadn't just turned gray. It had bruised into a deep, sickly shade of violet and emerald that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. I remember the air becoming unnaturally still, as if the entire world had held its breath, and the only sound was the distant, rhythmic wail of the tornado siren echoing across the flat plains. I stood on my porch watching the clouds rotate with a slow, hypnotic power, and I knew that my shallow crawl space wouldn't be enough to protect me if a twister actually touched down on my street. That was when I saw my neighbor, Mr. Henderson, waving at me from his yard through the rising dust and the first heavy drops of rain. He was a quiet man who lived alone and spent most of his days tending to a garden that never seemed to grow anything, but he was pointing toward the heavy steel cellar doors embedded in the mound of earth behind his house. He shouted over the sudden roar of the wind, telling me that his shelter was reinforced concrete and that I would be a fool to stay in my wooden frame house while the sky was falling apart. I didn't think twice because the first crack of lightning was so loud it felt like it had split the earth right beneath my feet. I ran across the dead grass of our shared property line, my boots skidding on the mud that was already forming, and I followed him down the narrow concrete steps into the cool, damp darkness of the bunker. As soon as I cleared the threshold, Henderson pulled the heavy steel doors shut, and the sound of the world outside was instantly replaced by a muffled, terrifying silence. I heard the distinct, heavy clunk of a padlock being snapped into place on the outside of the door, followed by the sliding of a thick iron bolt. My heart skipped a beat as I turned around in the dim light of a single flickering bulb, asking him why he had locked us in from the outside when the latch was clearly designed to be operated from the interior. He didn't answer me at first. He just stood there with his back to me, his shoulders rising and falling with a heavy, ragged breath that sounded like a saw cutting through wet wood. The shelter was much larger than it looked from the outside, extending far back under the earth in a long, narrow corridor lined with shelves of unmarked tin cans and jars of murky, preserved vegetables. I asked him again, my voice trembling now, why the door was locked from the outside, and he finally turned around with a look of strange, glassy-eyed calm. He told me that the storm wasn't the real danger, but that the cleansing had finally begun, and that he was doing me a favor by making sure I couldn't leave until the world was empty enough for us to start over. I backed away from him, my hands searching the rough concrete walls for any kind of exit, but the only way out was the door he had just secured. I realized then that the shelves weren't just filled with food. There were stacks of old clothes, children's toys that were coated in a thick layer of dust, and several pairs of shoes that definitely did not belong to an elderly man living alone. My mind began to piece together the rumors I had ignored for years about the people who had gone missing from our town during the big storms of the past decade. The police always assumed they had been swept away by the winds or buried under debris, but as I looked at a small, pink backpack sitting on a cot in the corner, I realized the storms were just his cover. I tried to play along, keeping my voice low and steady even though I felt like I was going to vomit from the sheer terror of being buried alive with a madman. I asked him how long we would have to stay down here, and he began to wander toward the back of the bunker, talking about a new society and how he had been chosen to curate the survivors. While his back was turned, I scanned the room for anything I could use as a weapon or a tool, and my eyes landed on a heavy rusted crowbar leaning against a stack of wooden crates. I knew I only had one chance to overpower him before he realized I wasn't a willing participant in his twisted fantasy. Suddenly, the entire bunker shuddered as a massive roar vibrated through the earth above us, signaling that the tornado was passing directly over the property. The light bulb overhead flickered and died, plunging us into a thick, suffocating darkness that smelled of wet dirt and old metal. I heard Henderson laughing in the dark, a high-pitched, manic sound that made my skin crawl, and he started moving toward me, guided by years of navigating this underground tomb. I lunged for the spot where I had seen the crowbar, my fingers scraping against the cold iron just as I felt a heavy hand grab the back of my neck. We struggled on the floor, the sound of our grunts muffled by the screaming wind outside that felt like it was trying to peel the very earth off the top of us. He was deceptively strong for his age, his fingers digging into my throat with a localized strength that made my vision start to spark and fade. I managed to swing the crowbar blindly in the dark, and I felt it connect with something hard, the side of his knee or his shin, and he let out a guttural howl of pain, releasing his grip for just a second. I didn't wait. I scrambled toward the steps, feeling the cold concrete under my palms as I climbed toward the steel doors. I reached the top and pushed with everything I had, but the padlock and the bolt held firm, and I felt the weight of the earth pressing down on the metal. I realized that the wind had likely blown debris onto the doors, or perhaps a fallen tree was now blocking my only exit. Behind me, I heard Henderson limping up the stairs, his breathing now a wet, angry snarl as he promised me that he would make my stay in the bunker much less comfortable than he had originally planned. I used the crowbar to jam the interior handle, creating a temporary wedge that would keep him from pulling the doors inward to get to me, but I was trapped in a tiny 3-foot square space of concrete with a killer just inches away. I began to scream for help, knowing it was useless against the storm, but then I felt a sudden shift in the pressure. The roaring outside reached a crescendo, a sound like 1,000 freight trains, and suddenly the heavy steel doors were ripped upward with a violent, ear-splitting screech of tearing metal. The tornado hadn't just passed over. The suction had been strong enough to catch the lip of the door that wasn't perfectly flush with the ground. I felt myself being lifted, my hands clinging to the concrete edge as the storm tried to vacuum me out of the hole. I saw Henderson's hand reach up to grab my ankle, his face illuminated by a flash of lightning as he tried to pull me back down into his dark world, but the debris-filled wind was too strong. A heavy piece of timber, likely a ceiling joist from my own house, came flying through the air and slammed into the ground right where the doors had been, pinning Henderson's arm against the concrete rim. He screamed as the weight crushed his bones, and I used that moment of his weakness to haul myself out of the pit and into the chaotic, rain-drenched night. I ran through the debris-strewn yard, dodging flying shingles and broken glass, until I reached the ditch by the road and huddled there as the tail end of the storm passed over. When the sun rose the next morning, the town was a graveyard of splintered wood and overturned cars, but I was alive. The emergency crews found Henderson still trapped in the entrance of his shelter, his arm shattered and his mind completely gone, raving about the harvest he had lost. When they finally cleared the debris and opened the bunker fully, they found the remains of 4 other people who hadn't been as lucky as I was. I moved away from that town a week later, but even now, whenever I hear the wind pick up or see a dark cloud on the horizon, I feel like I'm back in that cold, concrete box, waiting for the sound of a padlock to click shut. I have always lived with the quiet fear that a single spark could take everything I own, especially living in a timber frame cabin tucked so deeply into the woods that the mail carrier doesn't even like to drive up the gravel path. It was a Tuesday night when that fear finally became a reality, starting with the sharp, acrid smell of burning plastic coming from the old wiring behind my kitchen stove. I managed to douse the small flickering flames with a heavy blanket, but the kitchen was quickly filling with a thick, gray smoke that made my eyes sting and my throat feel like it was coated in sandpaper. I grabbed my phone and dialed the local emergency line, knowing that the nearest professional station was nearly 40 minutes away in the valley, which meant I would have to rely on the local volunteer brigade. They told me a unit was already in the area and would be at my door in less than 10 minutes, which felt like a blessing I didn't deserve given how isolated I had chosen to be. When the headlights finally cut through the swirling mist of the driveway, I was standing on my porch, coughing and trying to clear the air from my lungs. A single, faded red truck pulled up, and a man stepped out wearing a heavy, oversized yellow turnout coat and a helmet that looked like it had seen decades of hard use. He didn't have a partner with him, which I thought was strange for a fire call, but he moved with a calm, practiced authority that immediately put my panicked mind at ease. He introduced himself as Officer Vance, and he told me that the rest of the crew was tied up at a brush fire on the other side of the ridge, so he had broken off to check my residence for hot spots in the walls. I led him inside, pointing toward the scorched area behind the stove, and I watched as he pulled a heavy iron Halligan tool from his belt and began to poke at the blackened wood. The first thing that felt wrong was the way he moved through my house. He didn't seem interested in the electrical fire at all, but instead, he kept glancing at the photos on my mantle and the locks on my back door. He told me that the smoke was still too thick and that I should go around and make sure every window in the house was tightly sealed to prevent backdraft oxygen from feeding any hidden embers. I am not an expert on fire safety, but something about his explanation felt hollow, as if he were reciting words from a manual he didn't quite understand. As I went to the living room to close the windows, I saw him through the reflection in a mirror, and he wasn't checking the walls for heat. He was reaching into his pocket and pulling out a heavy roll of industrial duct tape and a set of nylon zip ties. My blood turned to ice in my veins as I realized he wasn't looking for hot spots, but was instead systematically checking the house to ensure there was no way for me to get out. I tried to keep my voice casual, telling him that I thought I heard another siren in the distance and that maybe the rest of his crew had arrived to help him. He didn't even look up from his work, but his voice dropped an octave, becoming cold and devoid of the professional warmth he had shown on the porch. He told me that nobody else was coming because he had intercepted the radio dispatch on his own private scanner and had called in a false "all clear" for my address. I realized in that moment that the truck outside didn't have any official markings, and the uniform he was wearing was just a collection of discarded gear he had likely stolen or bought at an estate sale. I backed toward the front door, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it would burst through my chest, but he was faster than he looked in that heavy coat. He swung the iron tool, smashing the small side table next to the door and blocking my path with a shower of splintered wood and broken glass. He told me to sit down on the floor and stay quiet, explaining that he had watched this house for months and that he loved the way the wood looked like it would burn just right with me inside of it. The curiosity gap in my mind was replaced by a sheer, primal terror as I looked into his eyes and saw a vacuum of empathy, the look of a man who didn't want to rob me, but wanted to watch my life's work turn into ash. He began to move through the kitchen, splashing a clear liquid from a small canister he had hidden under his coat onto the floorboards and the curtains. The smell of gasoline began to compete with the lingering scent of the electrical smoke, creating a suffocating cocktail that made it hard to think straight. I knew that if I didn't act within the next 60 seconds, the cabin would become a furnace and the woods would swallow the evidence of what he had done to me. I noticed that while he was busy dousing the back of the house, he had set his heavy helmet down on the counter, and the Halligan tool was leaning against the refrigerator. I didn't scream because I knew a scream would only bring him back to me faster. Instead, I reached for the heavy cast iron skillet that was still sitting on the stovetop from dinner, its handle still warm from the earlier fire. As he turned the corner with a lighter in his hand, a small plastic flick-style lighter that looked absurdly domestic for the destruction he was planning, I swung the skillet with every ounce of strength I had. It hit the side of his head with a dull, metallic thud, and he crumpled to the floor, the yellow coat bunching up around him like a discarded tarp. I didn't wait to see if he was unconscious. I scrambled over his body and ran for the front door, but my hands were shaking so violently that I couldn't get the deadbolt to turn. I heard him groaning behind me, the sound of a wounded animal starting to wake up, and I realized he had blocked the door with the heavy table earlier. I turned and ran for the basement stairs, knowing there was a small coal chute that led out to the garden, a narrow opening I hadn't used in years. I tumbled down the wooden stairs, the darkness of the basement swallowing me, and I crawled through the dirt and cobwebs toward the tiny square of moonlight at the end of the chute. I could hear his heavy boots thumping on the floorboards above me, his voice calling out my name in a sing-song tone that was more terrifying than any threat. He struck the lighter, and I heard the whoosh of the gasoline igniting, the heat immediately radiating through the floorboards above my head. The basement began to fill with a new, much more aggressive smoke, and I squeezed my body through the narrow metal chute, the rusted edges tearing at my shirt and my skin. I burst out into the cool night air just as the windows of the kitchen shattered from the intense heat of the flashover. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road, my lungs burning and my vision blurred by tears and soot. I flagged down a passing trucker who saw the orange glow on the horizon and called the real authorities, the ones with the sirens and the real uniforms. By the time they arrived, The cabin was nothing but a skeleton of glowing embers, and the red truck was gone from the driveway. They found the stolen turnout coat in the woods a mile away, but the man who called himself Vance had vanished into the shadows of the valley. I lost everything I owned that night, but every time I see a fire truck or hear the distant wail of a siren, I don't feel safe. I just wonder if the man behind the wheel is the one who is supposed to be there. I moved to Oak Ridge because the brochure promised a sanctuary of manicured lawns and a community that looked out for one another. But I should have known that looking out for one another is often just a polite way of saying everyone is watching you. The town felt like a movie set where the grass was too green and the smiles were too wide. And within a week of moving in, I was invited to join the neighborhood watch. The meeting wasn't held at a community center or a library, but in the darkened basement of the street's self-appointed captain, a man named Marcus who wore his military surplus gear like a second skin. I remember sitting on a cold folding chair while the 12 other members stared at me with an intensity that made the back of my neck prickle, their eyes darting from my face to the notepad where Marcus was scratching down my license plate number and my daily work schedule. They didn't talk about preventing robberies or installing better streetlights. They talked about purity, vigilance, and the need to identify anyone who didn't quite fit the mold of their perfect little suburb. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on, and as the weeks went by, the watch became less of a safety group and more of a private militia that patrolled the cul-de-sac in silent, blacked-out SUVs. I started noticing small things that felt like warnings, like the way the street grew deathly silent whenever I stepped out to get my mail, or how my neighbors would suddenly stop their conversations and stare at me until I went back inside. Then came the night of the town tragedy, when a local teenager went missing after a high school football game, and the atmosphere in Oak Ridge shifted from suspicious to predatory. Instead of waiting for the police to do their jobs, Marcus and the watch decided that the culprit had to be someone new, someone who hadn't yet proven their loyalty to the neighborhood's unspoken code. I was sitting in my living room at 11 o'clock that night when every single street light on my block flickered once and then died, plunging the entire neighborhood into a pitch-black darkness that felt heavy and intentional. I stood by my window, peering through the slats of the blinds, and I saw a line of flashlights emerging from Marcus's house, moving in a synchronized formation toward my front yard. They weren't calling out for the missing boy. They were whispering my name in a low, rhythmic chant that sounded more like a ritual than a search party. I realized with a jolt of pure, cold terror that I had been chosen as the scapegoat, the outsider whose presence would be the perfect explanation for the town's sudden loss of innocence. I heard the heavy thud of a boot hitting my front door, followed by the sound of glass shattering in the kitchen, and I knew that my sanctuary had become a cage. I didn't reach for my phone because I had already seen the local police cruiser parked at the end of the block, its lights off, the officer inside chatting calmly with one of the watch members. In Oak Ridge, the law wasn't there to protect me. It was there to make sure the neighborhood's business was handled without any outside interference. I scrambled into my hallway and pulled the cord for the attic stairs, crawling up into the dusty, unfinished space just as the front door gave way with a splintering groan. I lay flat on the plywood boards, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain they could hear it through the ceiling, and I watched through the floor vents as the flashlights swept through my bedroom. Marcus was leading them, his voice calm and terrifyingly reasonable as he told the others that weeding the garden was the only way to keep the rest of the flowers safe. He stood directly below me, his flashlight beam illuminating the empty space where I should have been sleeping, and he let out a frustrated growl that made my skin crawl. He told the group to check the backyard and the garage, and I knew I only had a few minutes before they thought to look upward. I crawled toward the small circular vent at the peak of the attic's roof, the wood creaking under my weight like a warning. I managed to unscrew the plastic cover with my fingernails, feeling the cold night air rush in, and I looked out to see that the backyard was crawling with men in orange vests. My only hope was the overgrown tree-line that separated my property from the old industrial park, a place the neighbors avoided because it was unsightly. I squeezed through the narrow opening, my jacket catching on a nail and tearing with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the quiet night, and I slid down the steep incline of the roof. I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring my teeth, and I stayed low to the grass as I crawled toward the shadows of the pine trees. Behind me, I heard a shout of "There he is!" and the beam of a high-powered spotlight cut through the darkness, missing my head by only a few inches. I didn't look back. I sprinted into the thicket of thorns and briars, the branches clawing at my face as I pushed toward the fence that marked the edge of Oak Ridge's jurisdiction. I could hear them behind me, the heavy breathing of several men and the clinking of metal gear, but they were hindered by their own coordination, shouting orders at each other that gave away their positions. I found a gap in the chain-link fence and threw myself through it, tumbling onto the cracked asphalt of the industrial park just as the first of the watch members reached the tree line. They stopped at the fence, their flashlights illuminating the barrier, but they didn't cross it. Marcus stood there, his face half hidden in the shadows, and he pointed a finger at me in a silent promise that our business wasn't finished. They couldn't follow me out of their perfect world without risking the very scrutiny they worked so hard to avoid, and I realized that their power only existed within the borders of their own manicured nightmare. I walked for 3 hours until I reached a diner in the next town, where the lights were bright and the people were strangers who didn't care about my license plate or my schedule. I never went back for my belongings. I called a moving company from 3 states away and told them to keep whatever they recovered. The missing boy was found 2 days later in a different county, the victim of a random hitchhiking accident that had nothing to do with me or Oak Ridge. The town went back to its green lawns and its wide smiles, but I know that somewhere in that basement, Marcus is still scratching names into his notepad. I learned the hard way that the most dangerous predators aren't the ones hiding in the woods, but the ones who live next door and call themselves your protectors.